At this point, you can choose to discard your rough layer if you want. I'm actually going to keep my rough layer at a very low opacity, and just let it sit above the base layer. I personally kind of like that it gives the drawing a bit of history, so I leave it in there, even as subtle as it is. But it's totally up to you. Since I am going to keep my rough layer, the next step is to create a clipping mask by masking the rough layer to my base layer. To do this, make sure the rough layer is above the base layer. Then, holding the Alt key, click on the little line right between the rough layer and the base layer. You will see that your mouse pointer changes to this little double circle icon on older versions of Photoshop, and a white square on the new Photoshop CC. Once you click, you will also see that the layer above, in this case my rough layer, will have a little down arrow icon pop up next to it. This means that you have successfully created a clipping mask between the top layer and the lower layer. You can hold the Alt key and click the line between the layers again to release the clipping mask at any time. Let's go ahead and make a new layer and do the same process again. You can also just drag the new layer between the rough layer and the base layer, and it'll automatically clip down to the base layer. Now I'm going to move my new layer to the top of the clipping mask stack and grab my brush tool. You can see that when I paint on this new layer, I have effectively masked the new layer to the base layer, and therefore I don't have to worry about overpainting outside the lines or breaking the silhouette. Now again, this might not sound like that big of a deal, but this simple trick can really save you a lot of time with coloring and cleanup. And it makes sure that we always have a very clear silhouette. Be aware that this new layer does exist in its entirety. And if I release the clipping mask, I can see my red paint goes way outside the base layer, but I can always clip it back down again. So as we move forward, we are going to continue to clip all of our layers to the base layer. Let's get rid of this new layer that we've painted all this red on and create a new layer called Shadow Layer, and another new layer called Light Layer. These are going to be our base value layers. Let's start by dropping in the overall shadow pattern onto our shadow layer. Make sure that these layers are clipped to our base layer, and then let's select our shadow layer. For this step, I like to use a soft round brush and a cool bluish gray for the shadow color. Next, go to the Layer Mode drop-down menu, just here above our layers, and change our shadow layer to Multiply. This will make our shadow shapes transparent like a sheet of colored film. Now I'm going to jump right in and start painting these shadow shapes. Now as I'm dropping in these shadow patterns, this might seem a bit daunting if you're new to drawing and painting. You might be thinking, how am I supposed to know how the shadow shapes look? Knowing how to light a character from imagination can take some time and a lot of practice to really nail down. But it can be helpful, especially early on, to identify the direction of the light source. I'm going to draw a little 3D arrow up here in the upper left that helps show the angle of light I'm using for this particular character. You'll notice that it's a very similar light source to the sphere example we went through already. I'm going to do a quick little doodle of the sphere up here as well. This can be a bit of a mental exercise to translate this lighting situation onto a more complex form, such as a character. I'm going to use these little doodles up here to figure out where the light will hit the different surfaces and forms of this character. Another little drawing tip to keep in mind is that your eraser is just as important of a tool as your pencil or your brush. I'm using both my brush and my eraser tool as drawing implements to push and pull and control the shadow shapes of these forms. Again, doing this from imagination takes practice and a lot of observation of light and form in real life. I recommend taking live figure drawing or still life drawing classes to improve your drawing skills and your understanding of light and form. Now, aside from the actual technical skills of drawing and painting, we have to think about the readability of the design as well. This means as concept artists, we should generally keep our lighting situation pretty clean and simple. I don't recommend going too crazy with extremely dramatic or colorful lighting. I also would avoid bizarre lighting situations such as underlighting or backlighting. These kinds of lighting situations can distort the forms and colors too much, and our job as a concept artist is to communicate the character's 3D form as clearly as possible for our client or our team. So keep it simple. I would recommend sticking to a similar lighting situation as this character. Top-down lighting, slightly off to the side, tends to work pretty well. Okay, so I've gotten my first shadow layer laid in here. Now I'm going to create another shadow layer. I'm going to use the same color and the same multiply layer mode again. This layer is going to be the deeper areas of shadow as well as the core shadows of the form. Now you could skip this second shadow layer step and go for a more simple cell shaded look. But this second layer can really start to punch up the 3D volumes of the character quite a bit. So now we have our two shadow layers. So it's time to jump over to our light layer. For this layer, I use the same brush as my shadow layer, but I'll use a warm golden yellow color for the light. I'm also going to change the layer mode to overlay. This time around, I'm going to find the light and mid-tone areas of the form and wash those areas with direct light from the light source. Any surfaces that face the light most directly should have a bit more light hitting them. Keep this in mind as you're adding your direct light. Again, just like with my shadows, I'm using my brush as well as my eraser tool to push and pull these areas of light. Lastly, I'm going to make one more light layer and call it the highlight layer. We're going to use the same color as the light layer and use the same overlay layer mode. However, this layer is going to be much more focused on the key highlight areas. So for this layer, I like to use a bit of a harder brush so that my highlights can be a bit sharper if I want, especially for highlights on polished metals and other shiny surfaces. As I move through the form once again, I'm thinking about which areas are most directly affected by the light source, and also which materials would reflect the highlight most sharply. I'm going to make sure that the metal of his shoulder armor has some pretty distinct and bright highlights. I'm also going to add some sharp highlights to the prominent features of his face and beard. And I might even use this layer to wash in a bit more light into surfaces that most directly face the light. The last thing I'll do before I move on to color exploration is adjust the opacity of some of these layers. Right now the shadow and light pattern is a bit too harsh, So I'm going to lower their opacity to help the forms all flow together a bit more smoothly. The good thing about having our values on different layers like this is that we can adjust them individually, and we have lots of control over the value scale that we are working with. As you practice and get more comfortable with rendering 3D form, you may wish to paint more directly with the values and rely less and less on separate value layers like this. Direct painting is generally quite a bit faster, but I find it's easier for beginning artists to build up these values layer by layer, one step at a time, so that they can develop a better understanding of light and form in a more digestible process.